This week on Snark Squad Pod, we are talking about Pride and Prejudice. We are joined by Sari Riley and Sam from Thoughts on Tomes for our first ever live episode recorded at Booknet Fest in Orlando, Florida. Welcome to this special live episode of Snark Squad Pod. I am your host, Nicole Sweeney, and with me, as always, is my co-host.
My name is Marines.
And we are joined this week by two very special guests.
Hi, I'm Sam from Thoughts on Tomes. I have a YouTube channel, Thoughts on Tomes, and all kinds of social media in which I talk about books and other stories.
And I'm Sari. I work on YouTube videos at the company Complexly, mostly on the channel SciShow, and I'm an editorial assistant for the comic Monstrous.
I am super stoked about this episode because it is about one of my favorite things in the whole wide world, and it is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And I am tasked with the synopsis today, and I don't know how. I've literally read this book a million times, and I don't know how I'm going to do about this. But Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen is a romance story, a classic about a family, the Bennet family, which consists of Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and their 5 daughters. I almost said 4. And they're 5. I swear I've read this. There are 5 daughters. And it really tracks kind of the growth in the relationship of Elizabeth Bennet, who is the second oldest. And throughout the course of the book, they're all single, young women, and their mother is very concerned with getting them married because their property is entailed away from the family line. So when their father dies, they get left with nothing, no inheritance. So she's very concerned with marrying them off well so they won't be poor. And a rich man moves into the neighborhood, and that kind of starts off the entire story. And so Mrs. Bennet immediately starts trying to manipulate and calculate how she can get her daughters into this sphere and into the notice of Mr. Bingley, who has just moved in. And with Mr. Bingley, is that his name?
Yep.
This is great.
You're going great.
He brings his sisters and his best friend, Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy kind of get thrown into each other's paths, but the entire thing is that there is Pride and Prejudice involved. See, you guys are happening there, and some rash kind of first impressions that are made, and some snap decisions, and Lizzie makes some assumptions about Mr. Darcy, and he's really rude to her too, right off the bat, and calls her not that pretty, which would be rude to anybody, and so that kind of starts off, but more and more they're put into the same situation, social situations. A militia comes to town and kind of throws a wrench into it because Lizzie starts catching some feelings for another guy named Mr. Wickham, who has a tie to Mr. Darcy, and so rumors start flying around, and Lizzie's basically Mr. Wickham's hot, he would never lie to me, and so she believes him over Mr. Darcy, and so their relationship just keeps devolving as you're reading it, but then all of a sudden Mr. Darcy's will you marry me? And Lizzie's no. I don't know if you've been tracking this whole thing, but the answer is no. But that whole thing kind of brings to the forefront the behavior of Mr. Darcy and the prejudice that Lizzie was really bringing. And so they kind of have to face both of that, and the truth comes out on both sides. And then their feelings start changing and their behaviors start changing from there until the end of the story. And throughout all that, Mr. Darcy has been meddling in Jane and Bingley's relationship as well, but they end up getting together. It's a happily ever after for them, and it's a happily ever after for Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. It is not a happily ever after for Mary and Mr. Collins, and I'm salty about that. And that's Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Thank you.
I'm really excited to talk about the lack of happily ever after for Mary and Mr. Collins, and why one of the many ways that Mrs. Bennet is the worst. But anyway, normally after we do the synopsis, our routine on the podcast is to ask everybody whether or not they liked the thing, but we're taking kind of a different approach with this because we're not just talking about the book. We are talking about the book and sort of its various adaptations kind of all at once. So the BBC adaptation, the 2005 movie, Lizzie Bennet Diaries, whatever. So Pride and Prejudice in pop culture. This is an experiment. Maybe it'll be a good idea. Maybe it won't work out. Find out. So rather than asking you whether you liked it, I'm going to take the same approach that we took on the MCU episode and just real quick, what is your background with Pride and Prejudice? When did you first read it? What's your experience with the adaptations, etc.?
Yeah, so I first read Pride and Prejudice in high school, and that's the only time that I have read Pride and Prejudice. So I have not. So this whole thing being an adaptation podcast is where I was like, yes, because I love every adaptation I've pretty much ever seen of Pride and Prejudice. Even if I don't like it as much as others, I'm always still highly enjoying it. So when we were like, let's talk adaptations, I'm like, I am absolutely all here for it. And I have rewatched certain adaptations multiple times, like some of them over 10, 15, stuff like that. So where she's reading the book multiple times, I'm watching the adaptations as many times as possible, sometimes back to back.
And this is really interesting because I also only read it in high school, and I haven't watched adaptations a bunch of times. I think I saw the 2005 adaptation once a while ago, and then to prep for this, I watched the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. I was in high school as it was coming out, so I had just read the book or was in progress of reading the book as that was coming out, which was a really interesting experience to have, like, reading the traditional book and then having this transmedia experience. And then to prep for this podcast, I was like, oh shit, I gotta read some adaptations. And so I read Pride and Prejudice and Zombies and the 2009 Marvel comic adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, just to, like, spice it up, add something to the podcast, because I won't have nuanced opinions about the BBC miniseries.
I love this. As I already mentioned, I read it for the first time as a freshman in high school as like fun reading, like not even required reading. I just wanted to read it, and I immediately fell in love. And I feel like I've been reading it at least once a year, every year of my life since then. And you know, I'm in my 30s. So, and then in the last couple of years, I discovered the audiobook version narrated by
Rosamund Pike.
And it is phenomenal. It is so brilliant, and it has become a thing that like is a comfort thing for me. And so if I counted the times that I just listened to the audiobook version in this year, I think it might be embarrassing. So this is a story that I'm constantly and consistently consuming. And that said, I always turn to adaptations. Like my chicken soup when I'm sick is like watching the BBC miniseries version of Pride and Prejudice. And I'm the only purist on this panel, but we'll get to that with the 1995 BBC miniseries adaptation. But I've also watched the 2005 Keira Knightley. I've watched the 1980 with Elizabeth Garvey in it. Okay, and I've watched it multiple times. And I've seen the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. I watched Pride and Prejudice and Zombies for the purposes of this podcast. I have read like additional things like Mr. Darcy's Diaries, like things like that are like extra, not written by Austen, obviously. And before this podcast, I also was like, what I've never really like checked out is like fanfic for Austen. So I just went into Archive of Our Own and was like, what's out there? There were a lot of like Darcy and Lizzie like wedding night stuff. I was like, fair, we don't get like even like a kiss, like fair, whatever, wedding night stuff, cool. And then a lot of it was like, how about if like Lizzie and Darcy didn't meet then and they met later? And I was like, okay, cool. They would fall in love later. So there's like things like that. I didn't read a ton of it, but I was just kind of trying to gauge what was out there.
But you have like very little background with fan fiction too.
Yes. Yeah. Like
wow.
I'm not a fan fiction person, like even like in my day-to-day like at all. And I don't know why I was like, what I've never thought about? There's got to be fan fiction of like Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. And there's like Bingley and Jane stuff out there as well. I just wanted to like be aware of it before I came here.
But that's like a smart way to go into it too. Like, because you are a super fan of Pride and Prejudice. Like you are. I know.
I would never think of that. But I would never like put it that way exactly. But yes, I am.
So I first came to Pride and Prejudice with the 2005 movie when I was in high school. Like I saw it in theaters, and then I bought the DVD as soon as it came out. And honestly, for like a solid month, maybe more, I don't even remember how long, but when I was in high school, like I would come home from school and put the DVD on, like that every day. Like that was my routine, was come home from school, put the DVD on, like do my homework, whatever. Like I watched this movie literally every day for like a month and a half. And it's previously on the podcast, I have mentioned that I am not a big re-consumer of things. Like I don't go back to things very much. So this is like, I don't know, this like foreign version of myself. But that is still definitely like chicken soup for me, is the 2005 Keira Knightley movie. I just love it so much. It's so magical. My other best friend also loves this movie and walked down the aisle to the music, the little twinkly. It's pure, okay? Anyway, I resent purist as a term for the BBC miniseries we are prepared to fight. I didn't read the book until college, and it wasn't assigned. It was also like just for fun. I was like studying abroad and like living in a place where I didn't have internet or anything, so I was like, I guess I'm gonna read a lot now, and so I cycled through all of Jane Austen's books that semester. And Lizzie Bennet Diaries came out when I was also a 20-something communications grad student, so that was like a very special and exciting experience. And I did not watch the BBC miniseries until preparing for this, and we'll get there.
This might make or break our friendship.
Yeah,
it's been a good run.
We're sitting on opposite ends of the table. It's fine. I also watched Pride and Prejudice and Zombies to prepare for this episode, so I'm very curious to hear how the book experience was for you. Because I knew we were going to be doing this here, I had downloaded the Rosamund Pike audiobook, and like that's been basically the only. Like I have read and listened to some other things in the last month and a half, but like basically just that, because it's so comforting. It's like very, very soothing and a great way to fall asleep at night. It's just like have Rosamund Pike reading to you and like soothe you to sleep, and it's beautiful. And I also, like in the last month and a half, have probably listened to it like a dozen times, just because like I finish it, I'm like, well, I guess we're gonna start that again. So yeah, that is my background with all things Pride and Prejudice. So let's just do that. Let's just do it. Let's just get to the BBC. Let's start talking BBC. I know Sam has like very extensive notes.
I do. First off, here's all of my notes that all of you can see in the audience, and there's a lot of things that are capitalized. So I didn't go into the adaptations that I have personally watched, but I had never watched the miniseries before this, so I was also preparing by watching it. And I knew that people had opinions about the miniseries versus the 2005. I also rewatch religiously the 2005 version. Like, when I first bought the DVD, I went and I kept continuing to watch it in the same day. Like, I had just watched it and I continued. It was bad. And also, I do the same thing with Lizzie Bennet Diaries. So I was not prepared for the BBC miniseries, I don't think. And I had all of these expectations going into it because people have very strong opinions about it. But I also was like, I know the BBC and I know how things are done, and I'm a little nervous. And yeah, I felt very awkward for the majority of watching it, but I also enjoyed it. Like, I enjoyed it because it was Pride and Prejudice, but I was also like, I am so uncomfortable for the entirety of the experience. I actually noted the few times when I felt like, oh, about it.
Okay, yes. But what about, if you can pinpoint at all, like the discomfort, like what was making you uncomfortable?
I think it was like the acting / the characters are so extreme, and I know they're extreme in the book. Like, I know they are, but I'm like, I'm so uncomfortable by Mrs. Bennet. Like, anything she does, I'm like, I want to hide. Like, I get secondhand embarrassment from like watching some media, and I was secondhand embarrassed by like a lot of the things that were happening. So I think, and also the moments when Lizzie and Darcy were hearing each other and seeing each other's faces in windows, like that moment when like the letter happens, like the discussion happens, the proposal happens, and they're like talking to each other in their minds, although not like, not actually magically, but that whole sequence, I was like, I want to crawl in a hole and die. I feel just like so awkward about it.
There were also a number of scenes, so I liked it. I enjoyed the last 2 episodes and could totally see myself going back and rewatching the last 2 episodes. I'm not sure that I will ever rewatch the first 4. And part of it, honestly, so twofold. Like, I think the biggest thing going into it is the fact that, like, obviously I have like a prior attachment to a different adaptation. It's like that's like a whole other sort of thing that with any piece of media, you're bringing your own like baggage and nostalgia to it. So there's that piece of it. Also, the fact that like this was the like the purist. You're a purist if you like this adaptation version. So there's like the condescension of the thing that I like. The like, I don't know.
The fans ruined it.
Yeah, the fans ruined it, you know? So there's that. But also with that in mind, like, it's not that there are no liberties taken here. Like, liberties are taken, and that threw me just because of the way that people talk about it. So going into this thing that has existed for, 20 years by the time I'm finding it, and like you have like all of the existing popular opinions about it framing how I am coming into it and reacting to it. It's like you can't like take that away from it. And so to go into it and find that liberties were taken like kind of threw me a little bit. So like it took me a second to figure out how to watch it. There's are a number of expository bits in the beginning that are like straight up condescending. Like as narrative choices, there are some conversations that happen in ways that I'm just like, you are explaining things to the audience in a way that I really did not that I would not enjoy independent of like Pride and Prejudice and my attachments. And so like those things kind of like sat poorly with me, but I think the biggest thing was just that like I went into it expecting things, and like that's not on this adaptation. Like that's like a larger like bit, a little bit of that is me, a little bit of that is fans. So I think, yeah, I don't know. And then I also feel very strongly about the casting of the 2005 version. I think I will give BBC Colin Firth, but otherwise sorry. And the casting of Jane, we talked about this. We had a whole email thread beforehand, but I believe I forget who said, but like that the casting of Jane is a crime in the BBC.
I was just about to say like it's criminal. Honestly,
no, I'm sorry.
I have feelings. No, and it's not even that I have like feelings about anything. I can sit here and admit, let's back up. Part of the reason that I was like really worried about doing like this episode is because Pride and Prejudice to me has reached this point where I cannot really think about it critically anymore. And we get into this whole like hazy thing of like what's critically, what's objective when you're talking about your personal opinions. But I just love it so much. And I mean, this is like something I've been reading since I was 14. So it's something that's like essential to the like my growing up experience. So for you to like sit here and be like, let me think about it, let's like remove this and like take a look at it, it's very difficult for me. And I think the same is true about the BBC adaptation. I've been watching it for so long. So to even like think about like your like exposition, I'm like, I don't fucking know. I can recite the entire thing. Like, like what is that to me anymore? I don't know. And so it's very difficult for me to approach it in that way. But I can like, okay, the casting, there's like some superior casting in the 2005 version, even in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. They like Lizzie, I think is spot on.
Yeah.
Jane is amazing. Like they've done some really great like casting. Colin Firth and I forget her name now. Lizzie from the 1995 BBC version are like my Darcy and Jane. So it's hard to like sit here and talk about it any other way. And I think that the main thing, if I'm trying to be as like objective and removed as possible, I think the main thing that the miniseries has going for it is that it is a miniseries. And there are so many like beats that you go, especially when you're rereading and reconsuming, that you're expecting from Pride and Prejudice. Like this scene, oh, this is where he says this to her and she like sasses him back. And you're like, yeah, like you're expecting all of these and to see the progression of their relationship. And so much of that is condensed by necessity in an hour and a half movie or whatever it is in the 2005 version, where there are multiple like scenes at Netherfield where they have all of these little interactions where you get them all in one, like, and they're like, let's take a turn about the room, let's do this. I'm like, whoa, we're going too fast. Like I need to like enjoy all of this. These are the things I want to see in my adaptation. And that's the main, if anybody I think who like kind of strays from there is maybe, they've got other things going on, but I think the main thing that the miniseries has going on is that it is a miniseries, and it has room to do more justice to the story, especially as somebody who really deeply, truly loves the story. Like, I love seeing all of that on my screen. And I understand the way that Keira Knightley's version, like, adapted it, and I think it made some really, really smart choices that I've only been able to see, like, with distance and time. When I first saw it, I was like, boo, like, don't want it. But, like, on rewatch, I'm like, man, they really, like, humanize certain aspects. They really give an extra layer of characterization to like Jane and Lizzie's relationship. Like there's something so sisterly about them in the movie. Like there's a lot of great things about the adaptation, but The miniseries is longer.
Yeah.
That's all I have.
Yeah. It's longer. That is true.
I think one thing that you're touching on that's so interesting too is that you really love like every single, as a super fan, every single piece. I know you get this label now for once in your life. Okay, listen. But I think because you're saying that you touch on every single piece, that you want to see every single piece. I just want to see the general themes. I want to see the angst, and the 2005 version is so angsty, and so that's why I'm like, I really want this, and I want those little scenes with like even the sisterly bonds and like that kind of stuff. And I feel like I didn't get, even though I got every single moment with Lizzie and Darcy in the miniseries, I didn't feel the chemistry with them. And for some reason, the way I feel, like viscerally feel the chemistry with the frickin' hand flex with the 2005 version. Like you feel it, heart palpitations, you know, where I just didn't get that with the miniseries.
It's definitely more like Victorian in its sensibilities and like the way that it kind of portrays the relationship and everything. And yeah, I get that. They definitely inserted angst into 2005.
I will say that one thing that I do appreciate in terms of, this is a little bit of like liberties being taken, a combination of like liberties being taken and the fact that it's a miniseries and it's longer. I think that other than the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which has, I think, the fairest and best portrayal of Lydia, the BBC version is fairer to Lydia than the book itself is. She's still silly and frivolous in the way that she is in the book, but like the book is very dismissive of Lydia. I think that something about, like, I don't know, maybe I think that actress is probably better than most of the other actors in the BBC, but like there was something about that portrayal of Lydia that I was like, yeah, I feel like you are a silly child, who's making some stupid choices because you're a silly child, and that. I don't know, that it felt fairer to Lydia than I think, and not in a way that was ever inaccurate from what is in the text, but I think it gave her the space to be whole in a way that she isn't really in the book, because even though it's not a first person, like it's Lizzie's story, and so Lydia is mostly just there like as a catalyst for some stuff, and so I think I really enjoyed, I don't know, the degree to which Lydia got to be whole in the BBC version.
I will say that I like the way that Mrs. Bennet is more extreme in the miniseries, what it does for the story. Because to really understand, Lizzie's, embarrassment and the way that Darcy removes, his friend from this whole situation. It's like, your family. Like, you really have to understand how they're all behaving. And I think that comes across a little bit more. And again, I think the 2005 is more humanizing. And you get those times of, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet in bed, laughing and oh, Jane will be so happy. And you kind of see that there is some sort of relationship there, where I feel like my interpretation of the book is Mr. Bennet is do not marry somebody beneath you because you do not want to do that. And he's speaking from experience. And that is very much portrayed, I think, in the miniseries.
Yes.
That separation, that the extremes of their personality, how they are mortifying, and that's kind of the point. And so I like seeing that versus kind of the softened 2005. They softened that and up the angst.
Yeah. I think, independent of feelings about Pride and Prejudice, I do also think, though, that the 2005 version is, in a lot of ways, it is just such a good example of how to thoughtfully adapt. It's very clear that at every turn they were making conscious choices. I think one of the things that I love so much about the 2005 version too is that as much as possible they included direct, these are Jane Austen's words, really, I don't know, just very thoughtfully and carefully, and there are a couple places where they switch who says something based on, but in ways that I'm yeah, it makes sense. This fits where you've tried to insert this beloved line with as much time as you're spending with these characters. It doesn't necessarily make sense for this person to say this thing, but you can still get this line in this place, and it achieves the same basic effect. And I don't know, I think. Yeah, I appreciate seeing that very, very thoughtful adaptation. That was my attempt at a segue.
And on the topic of adaptations, and I think we've had these conversations on the podcast before as well, in terms of where adaptations can exist separately from the work, and like that entire idea, like it needs to be like, you know, exactly like the book, and like, no, where can we adapt it to the medium or whatnot? But I think it's really funny to see the way that adaptations interpret different things. So like Lizzie, it says that she plays, like they ask her, do you play piano? And she says very poorly, like they don't know, not really. And the way that that is interpreted, like Keira Knightley is like banging on the piano, like beep beep, like not good at all. And then in the other one, she's like got some skill, like not great, you know, but so like even like the small things that are interpreted that way, like when she says she plays poorly, what does that mean? And you know, like kind of seeing the way that that like shifts from adaptation to adaptation.
I think that's where I can inject now, because we were talking about adaptations and not the BBC. The comic adaptation failed, in my opinion, where it kept a lot of Jane Austen's original words in it, but it just felt like it was not a thoughtful adaptation at all. They were trying to condense it in a way that, like, the 2005 movie compared to the BBC miniseries, it sounds like condensed the story so you could get Pride and Prejudice abridged, you could get the tension, you could get the build-up, you could get the relationships between everyone, but it did it in such a way that didn't take advantage of the medium and didn't add anything to the experience of understanding the story of Pride and Prejudice. Like, I have feelings about the art and like the way that they cut down the writing, but, and especially the art, they just did not, I don't know who did the character design in that book. I do. His name was Hugo Petrus. I'm sorry, my man.
Sorry,
you did
Hugo.
a bad job. Everyone had like pursed lips the whole time.
Oh.
All the drawings looked very, yeah, the Bennett sisters looked bad. But the way in which that was adapted, it wasn't like, hey, how can we make this story and enhance it in comics so we can like capture scenes or capture emotions or have these like capture subtle expressions. That's really good in comics, where you can have actors in a panel with subtle expressions or in subtle positions that are basically a freeze frame that you can't capture in a movie. But they didn't take advantage of that. They did things like, let's just have a bunch of text bubbles on screen as Lizzie, or on the page as Lizzie is like reading the letter or something like that. Not doing anything creative with that, just here is the story with illustrations. And I don't know, it's like, it was such an unthoughtful adaptation that I'm sure thought was put into it, but it was not taking advantage of the medium.
Not making use of like, how do you tell this story as a comic?
Yeah.
But just like, I don't know, draw some shit.
It's there, yeah. Like, and there was clearly, like, there were parts of it that seemed to be inspired by the 2005 movie. I read a little bit about it afterward, where they were like, they basically like took this shot and then illustrated it, or they couldn't decide which version of Darcy to include. So some illustrations look more like Colin Firth, and some look more not like him. I don't know. It seemed like a mess of a project. It was Marvel. Like,
You have too much money, too many resources to justify.
yeah, like what this I forget when. I think it was during the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies like rise in popularity, where Marvel was like, let's adapt Jane Austen into a comic, and then it ended up being what it is. Like, it's a good way to read Pride and Prejudice in a condensed way, but you're not gaining anything from the experience. Like, I wouldn't prefer to read this version over the original book.
And that's the key in an adaptation, is what am I gaining? It's not only about like translating the media, but what is this adding to my experience? And I think that if we are talking about like thoughtful adaptations, the Lizzie Bennet Diaries is like,
Yes.
I mean, just the entire like idea of like the transmedia and the way that went about that, and the way that they adapted the story and then modernized it at the same time, like amazing. And I know you guys all have feelings.
Oh my gosh. Oh, who wants to start? I mean, I have a lot of capitalization again, but just the whole experience, and what I love is that every time that I watch this, even if I don't feel the chemistry as much in certain adaptations, I still get it at least at some point. And what I really like about the Lizzie Bennet Diaries is her sort of like angry obsession with him that you get to see played out, like where she talks about him all the time, and you're like, and all her friends are like, Lizzie, like, why are you making it about Darcy? And she's like, I'm not, he's awful. Like, and it's so great. But then when you also get to see their, like, the tension that you have of, like, when are we going to see Bing? And, like, when are we finally going to see Darcy? And, oh my gosh, that's Georgiana, and all that kind of stuff. Like, that tension was really fun. And getting to see their little interactions. I feel like the hand flex of that is when she, at one point, touches his shoulder and goes off screen, and he, like, dies a little bit. That is like, there's always that moment, and I feel like in every adaptation, and I wrote one down for the 1995, but I've lost it in all of my like, I'm so uncomfortable. But every single adaptation has like that moment for Lizzie and Darcy, which is what I appreciate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt like the Lizzie Bennet Diaries handled the Darcy reveal like in a very compelling way, like by having him cropped out of shot, you could never see his face, like that. Even having read the book simultaneously with watching it, it was like, I know what's going to happen, but I want to know. Right? Please. And I also thought like I'm just interested in transmedia in general, but the way that they use Twitter accounts, for example, to like engage with the fandom and like give these characters personalities outside of the videos. And it was, I don't know, it was such an interesting way to do it, to like continue the character on in almost a fandom space of, this is not text that we're pulling from the book. These aren't like quotes from Jane Austen that were thrown in there. This is like building up to Darcy's realization that he was wrong, or things like that, or building tension in different ways that could only happen with people not talking to each other, but like posting their thoughts publicly online, which is a thing that we all do. Mm-hmm. So that was like just like a really cool way to tell the story, even though you knew it was coming. But
yeah, the transmedia component, getting to see, this is, I guess, not really transmedia, but like the layered, getting to see Lydia's vlogs, like in conjunction with it, I like to this, even though you know it's coming, like you know what's happening, like Lydia, for example, like that was a really, like that was a thing that, yes, I know something is going to happen with Lydia, but you really didn't know. Like you had no way of knowing, like they had to make a lot of choices about how to modernize this, and like that was, I don't know, what are they going to do? How are they going to introduce that? And I think it was like, just so thoughtful, just so like, yep, that's like, that makes so much sense. It's so clear. And also it gave Lydia, that's like the best telling of Lydia, I think, of all. And not just because like it is, you know, sort of designed to give that character some agency. Like I think it's the best version of Lydia, just even like if you're only watching the 100 episodes of the Lizzie Bennet Diaries proper, I think it's the best version of Lydia, but I think it is particularly the best version of Lydia because she also had the sort of side vlogs, and like she actually got to like have a voice and tell her story instead of just being, you know, this like silly child, which after listening to the original every night for the last month and a half, I like, it is a thing that the more that I listen to it, the sadder that I get about like the ways in which Mr. and Mrs. Bennet failed her as parents. Like it's more, Mrs. Bennet especially, I just, oh, god damn. She makes me so angry. I'm furious, which I'm furious with her particularly because Mary and Mr. Collins is the real OTP, and that's where we'll circle back to that eventually. But yeah, that version of Lydia and using the modernization and like the vlog style format was all very, very cool. Less cool though, and the more times I rewatch it, the more struck by this I am, is that like Lizzie crosses the line so many times with the sharing of other people's information in ways that are necessary for the story to function. Like you just, as an audience member, like this is the suspension of disbelief that you have to engage in, that like, it's cool that she's just like talking about her sister's love life to thousands of strangers, no big deal. But like, there are a number of moments of the story where I'm just like, oh, no. And I think the more time passes, and I don't know if this is like just me or what, but like, you know, more time spent in, you know, YouTube communities and stuff, the more that I'm like, oh, no. You need to be much more careful with other people's information than Lizzie Bennet is. But, you know.
I think that this is like really interesting. Instead of like an adaptation just of like a reimagining or whatnot, I think the Lizzie Bennet Diaries and also Pride and Prejudice and Zombies does this really special thing where it assumes that you are already like a fan of the thing. Not that you need it to watch it, but like that whole thing of like cropping Darcy out and like the big reveal of like that is only there and only like it only works if you're already a fan. Like if you're like, what does Darcy look like? It assumes you know what the story is going for. You don't need it to enjoy it, but there's that level of like, and the same with like Pride and Prejudice and zombies. It's assuming that you like Pride and Prejudice and you want to add zombies. Like that's like the entire appeal. It's like this thing.
I agree with you about Pride and Prejudice and zombies, but to that point about the Darcy reveal, I disagree because I think that everything that Sam was saying about the angst of the story and why the fuck is this girl so obsessed with this guy is that she cannot shut up about him in all of her vlogs. Like I think that works on its own. Like I think that there's an element of like you're watching this like, well, like clearly you're in love with this dude. Like I like the fact that you like won't shut up about him all the time in all of your videos. Like something else is going on there. So even if you don't know the story, like I think that there is Darcy buildup. But I think Pride and Prejudice and zombies 100% is like, you like Pride and Prejudice. Now there's zombies.
Like nothing else. I mean, I enjoyed it.
Yes.
I told people I watched this, they were like, "Oh, you hated it, right?" I was like, "No, I loved it." What? It's like everything I love about Pride and Prejudice. But like during the proposal scene, they're fighting, like literally like punching each other. Which, like, yes. And also, number two, didn't you want to punch Darcy in that scene too? Like he's like a jackass. So like everything about just like taking this thing you love and like adding like another element like that was amazing. And I don't know, I guess because I'm coming at the Lizzie Bennet Diaries as a fan, my reveal was like, okay, who is this person, and not necessarily what's going on, because I already knew. So
yeah.
I guess I'm projecting that onto that one, but for the other one, for the zombie one, 100%.
I like really wish I watched the zombie movie because I hated the book. Like all the adaptations that I read, I hated. And I don't know. I was like trying to untangle this today as I was stewing in my thoughts about it. Like, I think the movie was just very different. I read the Wikipedia summary to like try and figure out. Wickham had a whole arc in it with zombies that did not occur in the book. So the book was mostly like, you took Pride and Prejudice, maybe 70 to 80% of Jane Austen's language, and then they added in just like random asides about zombies, or like sometimes they called them zombies, sometimes they called them unmentionable, they had like 5 different words for what they were. And just would like mention that instead. So like instead of Darcy being really rich, it was like, oh, he's killed 5,000 zombies in the past couple months. And it felt very like weird and obvious. Like just like, here, this is about zombies now too, instead of
like
just
a Control F.
Yeah.
Find money, replace with zombies.
Like 100%. It's like, it felt like a student writing exercise or something, like take a story you love and make it about zombies too. And then this is like a personal pet peeve. Oh, I'm gonna get so right. They just like fetishized Asian culture so much in the book. Like it was, and in a bad way. Like it was clearly he didn't do his research, where like there was a whole tension. I don't know if this is in the movie, but I'm gonna go on a tirade about how Elizabeth trained in China. Like Lizzie trained in China with her martial arts or whatever, and then Darcy and his whole family, Lady Catherine de Bourgh and everything, like trained in Japan, and that's a whole separate thing. But then they kept saying that Lizzie had a katana, which is a Japanese sword, and like 101, you could Google what a Chinese sword is, and there are 2 options, neither of them is called a katana. And so it was just like, why it felt like, okay, zombies, whatever. Like, I know there was a whole thing where it was Sense and Sensibility and sea monsters and Pride and Prejudice and zombies and, like, the series of let's add a weird fantasy monster to it and in a fluffy, fun way. But then you had to add this layer of let's, like, make this story rich with Orientalism. And, like, of course they had to go train to fight the zombies in Asia because...
How did they get there and back?
Who knows?
The movie does actually acknowledge like that is a plot that like, or it's not even a plot, like it is like a throwaway detail, I think, in like 2 lines, 2 or 3 lines or something like that, that like, yes, there's a hierarchy of where you studied, and like, but that's it. There's no
it was constant in the book. It was like bizarrely constant. Like you'd had to keep, that was the tension point between Lizzie and Darcy for so long, was like the fact that they studied different forms of zombie killing.
Listening to you talk about it, I like circle back to the point about like what the BBC adaptation has going for it is that it's longer, and this feels like a situation where the opposite is like a win, that like that where the movie succeeds. Like this is like the whole thing is a gimmick of, you know, now there's zombies and like you're having the same Jane Austen dialogue, but like they're fighting, either like the proposal or like the fight. There's a fight training scene with the sisters that was also fantastic, and like again it's just they're sitting there talking about the men, but like they're doing fight training for killing zombies, and like it's a gimmick, but like over the space of about 2 hours, like that's about like the welcome, like the lifespan that you can have for that kind of gimmick before you're like, okay, I'm done now. Like I needed to be over this like hours ago. I think is part of it. Also, I don't know if this is in the book or if it's just in the movie, but the changes to Lady Catherine de Bourgh are delightful and very good. And I don't know if that's just Lena Headey being awesome, because that's who Lena Headey. I always pronounce her name wrong. I don't know if it is her being fantastic that makes me think that the change is fantastic, but they turned her into like this like badass zombie killer, and I'm like, yeah, that's good. I'm into it.
And Matt Smith is Mr. Collins.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean,
come on.
I
I didn't even like Matt Smith, which is why I like him as Mr. Collins. I'm like, yeah, you're awful.
Basically what we're saying is you should go watch Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies.
So I'm curious, I don't know, because we were talking about individual adaptations for a little bit, but in your kind of opinion of your experience of the story, and apart from this just being really old, what do you think it is about this story that like it lends itself to like the love that it has and the adaptation and the way that it kind of just keeps existing, and why it's like persisted in pop culture?
I think that whole like sort of miscommunication plot line that I typically hate in like all other books, but for some reason works in here. This like them always missing one another, like that's just a human experience that literally everyone's had. And also kind of that hate to love thing that I feel like a lot of people really like you can just adapt that in so many different ways to so many different time periods and so many different people that I think that it's just going to live on forever because of that kind of miscommunication, Pride and Prejudice, snarkiness that like almost everyone enjoys.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And I think because it's such, like, mostly drawing from, I think the Lizzie Bennet Diaries is my most meaningful interaction with this. It's such, like, a character-driven story, and the ways that you can take these very timeless, like, everyone has friends like all of the Bennet sisters, or could, like, apply those characteristics to different people, and the way that, like Sam was saying, that this is, like the tension build up, the hate to love stories, like this is such a quintessential story, and these are such quintessential kind of characters that you can get behind and that you can understand their flaws and their successes, that it's inevitable that it is like people will come up with adaptations for this. People will find ways to put these characters in different situations, and like that's the nature of tropes, that's the nature of storytelling, is that you are remixing characters and mythos and whatever from stories and stories and stories. And this is just like a particularly salient one because people connect with these characters and connect with these family, like everyone has a family, everyone has family drama. And so you can take this and put that and adjust it in a way that makes it interesting to you, or that makes it more salient to you, or highlights the themes that you get out of it more, whether that's sisterhood or the romance or the family or whatever.
I think the fact that the characters are so extreme too is what makes it, because then you can like water that down and put it in different settings way easier because the extreme was already the book. So you can just take that and really adapt that and make them, you know, like more human in the different versions that we've been talking about, like Lizzie Bennet Diaries and like the 2005 version, and because you can really distill that. And I was thinking while we were talking, but didn't get a chance to say it earlier, that I don't think of Pride and Prejudice as something that really makes me cry, but I cry at least in 3 different episodes in Lizzie Bennet Diaries, like because of how human they make it. But that was never its original intention. Jane Austen never wanted us to be sobbing over Lydia, I don't think. But yet we are in this other adaptation. So I think the fact that they start out so extreme makes it easier to adapt it in different ways.
And I think that the extreme nature of some of the characters makes it easy to relate to, if that makes sense. Like, not, my mom isn't like Mrs. Bennet.
My mom is.
I was gonna say, my mom definitely wants me to get married, and if he were rich, like, she wouldn't be upset. So like those like extremes lend themselves well to like being able to like oh, like some of this is in like somebody that I know, and like being able to translate that, I think really makes it a work that you attach to and that you want to see adapt. Like if another adaptation came out tomorrow, I'd be first in line. I'm not one of those people that's like, no, like adapt it in every way you can. I'll go watch it. Like, here's my money.
Because there's something very like pure and simple at the heart of this story that yes, like as all of you guys have been saying, can be taken in so many different directions, and you can do so many different things with it. And like tension points, like you mentioned, just with Lizzie's like piano playing, like there's the text says plays poorly, but like what does that mean? And so you can everybody can answer that question however many different ways they choose to. And yeah, I also will continue to give my money. How do you want to answer that question? We didn't ever circle back to Mary and Mr. Collins.
Like, all I want to say is that they should have ended up together.
Yes.
So this is a grievance that I have with the BBC. This is one of my BBC notes, is that they took out Mrs. Bennet explicitly pushing saying Lizzie next to her in both age and beauty, whatever, that whole like spiel, that like she is responsible for not fucking knowing her own daughters well enough to recognize that the clear and obvious solution to this, like whatever, was to say, oh hey, what about my daughter Mary? She's like really obsessed with preaching at people. Like y'all would be real good together. She's like a little smarter than you. Like you guys would improve each other maybe a little bit. I don't know. This would be a very good match. You would be very happy together. And yes, like the more times that I like listening to it every night for the last month and a half, like getting through all of that, I think I need to just start writing the Mary and Mr. Collins fanfic to like get it out of my system, because I have a lot of feelings.
Coming to SnarkSquad.com.
It's the bonus episode. You and Mari going back and forth.
Yeah. Anything else? This is normally the kind of stuff that I would edit out of the podcast, but because this is a live episode, or the lost episode, who knows, they were all being recorded on one audio track, and it's like really difficult to edit that stuff out in that way. I saw something on Twitter a while ago, and I was trying to find it, but whatever. But somebody tweeted, I really enjoy seeing, I have seen several in the last like month, people just randomly tweeting things about Pride and Prejudice, and I'm just like, this is great. Like this is still a thing. Like there's no cultural reason, like there's no adaptation that's like coming out or whatever. It's just that this story endures, so people are still talking about it, and it's great. But somebody tweeted something that it was like, Lizzie, how could, Lizzie and Jane talking about Wickham, and Jane being like, are you sure you want to trust this guy? You like just met him like 2 days ago. And Lizzie being like, but how could he just stand there and be hot and wrong? How could somebody who's hot just stand there and be wrong?
The only little thing that I wanted to add kind of at the end, because we are at Booknet Fest, and because like my whole like online like book persona and my channel is about like reading critically, so I get this a lot where people will ask me like, what's your favorite book? And my answers kind of vary between like Jane Eyre or Pride and Prejudice, because they're the books that I've been reading the longest, and they're classics for a reason, and there's obviously something there. But like the snottiness that you get when you're like, oh, you're an Austen fan. Like, there's that like level of condescension that I get so many times when I tell people that Pride and Prejudice is my favorite book. I don't know, it comes from every angle. It doesn't matter, but there's just kind of like that, and I think it comes from that place because it is like a very simplistic and tropey kind of story, which is what makes it endure and makes it lovable and makes it adaptable, but that makes it, even though it's a classic, I think that it's looked down upon in the book world a lot, especially as like your favorite. It's like kind of #basic is what I'm saying, is to say that like Pride and Prejudice is your favorite book. And I know that I'm the only one that's like read it, or like, multiple times, but I don't know if you've ever encountered anything like that, like the looking down on like Pride and Prejudice.
I think I had a different experience approaching it because I had to read it as a school assignment for the first time, because it was a classic. So like my first impression of the book was like, you need to read this because this is like English lit in high school, and you're going to have to take an AP test and like be able to write analytical essays on something. And so the way that I was introduced to the book was not like, this is a piece of media that you might like grow to love and treasure and like you should appreciate as a story, or like something that I voluntarily signed myself up for, of like, I'm interested in this, I'm interested in these characters, so I'm going to keep reading. And I think that has colored my ability to appreciate, like in the same way that you said you can't look at it as objectively because it's like so close and near and dear to your heart. It's so far away from my heart that I could probably like, I have broken down some of those things and have grown to love it as a story, but I will always be more interested in what people can do to transform it than the original work. Like, I'm infinitely more interested in the Lizzie Bennet Diaries as a transmedia experiment than Pride and Prejudice as a story, which is why like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is like a weird, interesting middle space, because okay, you're doing an adaptation, you're doing something different with it. I didn't like what you did with it, but please play more in that space where you're like taking this story and throwing it far, far away from its original source material and figuring out what weird things you can do, because that is what's interesting to me about taking classic stories, because I don't have that, like, so far away from purists, like maybe even farther away from Nicole, of like, please don't do anything with the original, just like take it and then do whatever you want.
I think the thing that's interesting about that, and it's not specifically something I've encountered with Austen, but just with the like splitting of classics that people kind of do with like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, Jane Austen, and then like Moby Dick and Tolstoy and whatever. Like there's that split that I've encountered, because like some of my top favorites would be like Pride and Prejudice, Wuthering Heights, and it's like, oh, but you haven't read, you know, like War and Peace, you know, and it's like, oh God, stop. You know, it's the same thing that we're continuing to encounter now, and that we've had discussions about today of like, oh, women like it, so it's shitty, you know, like, and it's just, or it's at least below the like the men's stuff. So I've definitely encountered that, but nothing specifically like Austen targeted.
Yeah, I also have no like personal specific experience, but as soon as you asked that question, I was like, I mean, yeah, this makes perfect sense, because it fits into larger conversations about whose preferences are valued and validated. And so like, yes, of course, because it is predominantly liked by like women, and then the same way like YA or, well, you know, whatever, because it's predominantly, you know, it's teenagers. Like, I think like, yes, anything that isn't straight white men it is the predominant target, then, and people who appreciate it and who feel seen and validated by it, then I don't know, for everybody else it is somehow less than. But like, also the story endures for a reason, and I don't know, like maybe check why you're such a snob.
I was going to say fuck off.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. Like, ask yourself, like, I don't know, like, what baggage are you bringing to this? I mean, like, which isn't to say that the story has no flaws. Like, that's not at all what I'm saying, or that Austen's writing is without flaw, whatever. Yes, all of that is valid and true. But like, to be dismissive of it on its face was like, oh yeah, basic bitches love Jane Austen. Like, fuck you.
Like, let people like what they like.
No. And pumpkin spice is delicious. So. I actually have a question, because we all kind of mentioned this in this love of adaptation. What kind of way that we haven't seen yet would we like to see this adapted?
Ooh, that is a very good question that I don't have any.
Musical.
I know. I'm trying to think. I'm like,
is there a musical? Is there a musical?
I mean, there's like the Bollywood stuff.
Oh, that was on my list of my to-watch list, and I didn't get there. I didn't do that.
I've definitely seen some really good fan casts with like more diverse casting.
Yeah.
Which has been really cool. I feel like I saw like an Idris Elba at one point, and I was like, yeah. So I think that's what I've seen
Mr. Darcy.
Yeah, that's, I think, cosign on that. That's all I got.
I'm like trying to think. I don't know. I love cartoons, but I don't know if this would be a good cartoon. I don't think it would be.
Yeah.
So I can't say that with confidence, because I don't think that this story is meant for that medium.
Yeah.
Because that's my number one thing with an adaptation, is like, look at it. Is it okay for this medium? You're not doing anything fun, so no. Yeah. All Behind Race Bent. That's what I liked. Lizzie Bennet Diaries got Bing Lee going on.
Right.
And that was great. I loved it. Yeah.
To that point, though, about like, does it fit in another medium? This is the thing. Like, I do like very strongly love the original. Like 2005, I have like that like strong attachment to it, but like the novel itself, there are things about just Jane Austen's writing, like the narrative voice that I just really deeply enjoy, and like there are ways that you can adapt that and still capture pieces of that, but like that is a thing that exists as a novel, and like that is all of those things that I really truly deeply enjoy and love about the original book, which I say this as somebody who also was like, yeah, all the adaptations, give them all to me, I will watch them all, great, I'm on board. But like also there is something about it in its original form that I'm like, yeah, like it's doing things that live best there, and that I don't think any adaptation has really been able to properly capture that thing that I enjoy so much. Specifically, that I enjoy so much about having Rosamund Pike say all of Jane Austen's words to me. But like,
Jane Austen is hilarious.
Yeah,
she's like really
yes.
deeply funny, and I don't know if I realized that until like rereading like down the line. But all of her commentary and everything that she's saying about like the interaction is comedy, and so like reading that, I don't know if there's any adaptation that's captured that like tongue-in-cheek, like comedy, like social commentary exactly. And it's difficult when you don't have a narrator to really capture that. But I think that that's something that's going to live on in Jane Austen's work that probably, I don't know if we'll ever get it captured in an adaptation, but that's probably what people will keep trying.
Yeah.
And I'm here for it.
I will support all of your efforts. I think on that note, that seems like a good place to end this live episode of the podcast.
Or lost episode.
Or live or lost episode of the podcast. Cool. All right, we did it.
Thank you so much to everyone at Booknet Fest for their patience in putting up with us. A special thank you to, and I'm going to use Twitter handles here to make it easier to find everybody, but Alicia at Alicia Live in Life and Arthur at Lembo A3 for all of their sort of technical on-site help, coming in clutch with some logistical things that we had not properly planned for. Thank you guys so much for helping to make this episode happen. As always, if you are enjoying the show, we would love it if you would consider supporting us even for just $1 a month at patreon.com/SnarkSquad. We would love to hear your thoughts on all things Pride and Prejudice and this episode. You can find us at SnarkSquad.com, where there will be a post dedicated to this episode, or you can find us on Twitter at Snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says. Mari is at My Name is Marinez. And you can find our guests at C.E. Riley and at Thoughts on Tomes. Thank you as always to Stefan Chin for the delightful theme music that is playing us out right now. And we will be back with a normal non-live episode next week. Bye!